It's great to see so many people come on a Saturday to listen to talks about population. So my talk is going to concentrate on the educational compositions of migration flows, and it's joint work with Xu Chang, who is a master's student at Shanghai University. So he worked on this for his thesis, and then Zhe, who's sort of working with us now. She's a PhD student at Shanghai University as well. So we're working together to try and develop the thesis into a fully fledged paper. So still a bit of a work in progress, but I look forward to feedback there. So our basic motivation is really, well, we're coming from a demographic perspective, like thinking about how does migration vary by education. So we know generally in demographic processes that age and sex are like the largest sources of heterogeneity. The variation in fertility, mortality, and migration tend to be explained by age and sex differences. And then Wolfgang Lutz argued that education is then the third sort of component of that. Sometimes it's first or second in some processes. So we conceive, when we take this perspective, thinking about the variations in demographic processes. For migration, age, we know there's been many studies looking at the regularities of migration by age. Tends to peak in the sort of early 20s and then decline thereafter throughout the remaining life course. And for sex, we sort of know generally sort of there's been a feminization of migration, that females are now migrating about the same rates as males, especially in more developed countries. But the education sort of view of how migration varies by education, it's a less clear cut. There's some studies that might suggest sort of higher educated migrants migrate more, and then there's the converse as well. In different settings, we're getting sort of completely different views. So we really wanted to sort of take a global view, try and get as much data on education by migration, and then see what the data is saying. And key to looking how the variations might change was trying to link that with development. Of course, like migration could view as just a byproduct of development, right? So it's kind of always key to understanding migration is to look at development. And related to that is this idea of like brain drain and brain gain that's been sort of very prominent in recent decades. There's increasingly selective policies to attract highly skilled migrants, and the idea of human capital loss. So trying to get this sort of quantifiable understanding of the size and structure of immigration flows by education really can help us try and drill down to these questions related to brain drain and brain gain and development. The problem is that the current measurements of like human capital, education-specific global international migration studies usually simplify migration as a kind of binary variable, so whether you're college educated or not. Sometimes they label that as high skill or not high skill, but it's just whether the migrant has education or university education or not. And that tends to be based on stock data, so that is that they might look at the changes in the populations of migrants with a university education between like 1990 and 2000, see how it changes over the time. But unfortunately, with that data, you're sort of unable to locate where the migrants got educated. You just know they have the university education, but you don't know if they got it in their origin country or in the destination country. Okay. So our aim was to really try and delve a bit more into the flow data, or try and find flow data, basically. We looked by educational attainment and tried to go across as many countries as possible. And then we tried to use like a descriptive model, a multi-level modeling framework to account for different variations across all the countries, to look at how these variations in the compositions of education across different levels of development. To measure development, we just use the Human Development Index. I'm sure many of you know that, developed by the UN population, the UN, yeah, and it's sort of composed of three elements. So the health, the education, and the living standards. So we use three different measures that they use: the life expectancy of birth, the mean years of schooling, and the GNI per capita, the gross national income per capita. And of course, now actually the education has two measures, but we need to update that, and we just, for the moment, are using mean years of schooling. So for the data, that's really the key to this, looking at these question, right, on the educational compositions. And it's really not in published migration statistics. Like government offices that publish international migration data, they basically never break that down by the education of the migrant, because they're not asking that in the surveys, or it's not in the registration data, or there's maybe perhaps not the demand for that. So we turn to the harmonized census microdata published by IBUMS International. So that provides like a sample of the census, maybe up to 10%, maybe, where you have in some countries, they're asking questions in the census, quite a lot of countries are asking questions in the census about migration histories. So they might ask a question like, where were you 1 year ago? Or where were you 5 years ago? Different countries having different definitions. Or they might ask, like, which region did you live in before? Or where that option on the region might be abroad. So then you could also pick up whether they were an international migration. So along with these migration sort of questions or responses, we can also get questions about the basic demographic details, including like the age, the sex, and the education that we were really interested in looking at for this study. And then also we can get the person weights. So that's to make the data representative from the census sample to the national level. We can weigh the responses. So in the end, we went through all the possible countries in the IPUMS sort of database that we could get our hands on that were asking these migration questions. And so we had identified 1.96 million individual international migrants recorded that they were over 25 years of age. So everything, and we'll talk about that, it's like that they've completed their possible sort of education attainment, because we're just concentrating on those sort of, adults and above from 25 onwards. So we had to do that, we had to go through like a massive load of data. So it was over 500 million census records, and we're covering 80 countries and 220 censuses or samples. So and then when we weight up that 1.96 million, it represents about 34 million migrants. So this bullet point, it's about like 80-90% of the work was just trying to process all this data. But it was feel terrible to kind of skip forward because it took so much time. So this is just a plot to show the kind of coverage of the countries that we were able to get the samples from IPUMS. So very good coverage in the Americas and parts of Africa, and then and Asia. Then you see some countries we had like lots of samples from, going back to like the 1960 census. And then we might have had some countries they had like big, large-scale surveys as well, not just the census, but like inter-census surveys as well. And then this was just the most recent data point for each country that we had a data point for. So most of the data was kind of recent, but some of the data went back even further, back to the 70s and 80s. Okay, so this is the plot of what we find in the data. So, does this work? Yes, okay, perfect. So what we have are the educational shares of the migrant flows against the development. And each country is plotted in each box like once. So if you imagine, I think this one here, the second to the left, is Spain in 2011. So they have 0.06 is the share of the immigration flows with less than primary. And then they have 0.3 that are primary, and then 0.36 that are secondary educated, and then 0.3 that are university educated. So they sum to 1 across, when you take the points and then take them across. So we can see there is some kind of general patterns here, right? It's not completely random. Like for the less than primary completed, the immigration flows tend to be highly like less than, with sort of very low education level, at low levels of development. But as the development level increases, we see more and more that falls. And it goes the sort of opposite way for the secondary and the university completed. As the development level in the destination country goes up, we get more and more sort of secondary and university completed migrants as a share. And for the primary completed, it's kind of a bit of everywhere. Perhaps there's an inverted U, or perhaps it's just like a kind of parallel lines. Not too sure. Okay, and then this is a plot for the female share of the immigration flows by their education levels. So in general, right, if it's over the line here, that's saying it's a more female flow for the less than primary in this box, or the primary included in this box. And if it's below the line, then it's more sort of male dominated. So in general, most of these points tend to be slightly below the line, but especially at these low levels of development and the higher levels of education, then we see that the flows at the low levels are more heavily male than they are female. Okay, so to try and summarize that data, I guess we use this set of multinomial, multi-level logistic regression models to try and describe this variation of the composition of the immigration flows. So our response variable is this educational attainment composition with the 4 categories, and the controls we try to sort of account for the size of the country, the destination country, the proportion of the country that already has the foreign-born population in the country, and then the duration interval used in the census question, like where were you 1 year ago or 5 years ago, perhaps that has a little impact on the education composition, and then the destination country itself, so just like a random intercept just to sweep up all the sort of other factors in the destination countries. And we fitted a series of models. So firstly, we just looked at the HDI, and then we looked at the HDI components separately, and then we added them all together, and each time having the controls in there. So this is just the plot then of the first model, where we have the Human Development Index, which goes from like 0 to 1, and then the predicted, out of the model, the predicted composition of the immigration flow to the destination. So this is the HDI at the destination, right? And we can generally see, right, across all this data, that as the development goes up, then we get more and more university-educated migrants, and far less than primary completed migrants. And then, this is then the model where we broke it down separately. So this is one for the kind of living standard. It should be GNI, not GDP. There we have to correct that, sorry. And but we can generally see as the sort of living standards go up, then we get an increase both in the university-educated share and also the sort of migrants with less than primary completed education. And as the sort of life expectancy, so it's like the health of the destination goes up, then we get more university completed and maybe a bit more secondary completed, but these kind of more moderate increases than we're seeing kind of here. And then the last one, as the mean years of schooling, so this is like the education levels in the destination go up, and we're getting more and more migrants coming in that are educated as well, especially those that are secondary completed education. And then finally, we ran the models separately for each sex. So this is a plot that I showed you before. We're here for all, both males and females, and this is broken down by males and females. So we can see generally that similar, but perhaps the female kind of share of it's like sort of very low levels of university completed immigrants that are females coming in at low levels of development, but that rises really quickly once you get past a certain threshold, like an HDI of 50 or 0.5, as it's in this graph. So that is, sort of a summary of the findings that I just went through. I guess that, we find that the destination countries, at the destination country, as the development level increases, then the immigration flow becomes more educated, especially for female immigration flows. And then as the living standards increase, we get a higher share of immigration, especially of those with less than primary and university completed. As the health levels rise, and we get like these moderate increases in the shares with secondary and university completed education. And as the education levels in the destination increase, then we get a higher share of immigrants with especially secondary completed and a moderate increase in this university completed. So we think this is like a nice contribution because we've basically have these empirical evidence across many countries and settings. So we've been able to estimate these education-specific migration flows that are not really available in standard migration statistics published by government offices. We're based on millions of data points across many different countries and settings. And we're using flow data, not stock data, which is more classically used to study the brain drain and brain gain at the global level. And we're able to pretty much infer that the education is not in the destination country because all our sample was over 25. And some of these questions are, the migration questions are like, where were you 1 year ago? So it would be difficult to arrive in the country, do a university degree within 1 year, and being over 25. So we're fairly confident that would have been from the place of origin, the place of education. So we've done some robustness checks, but we're still working on that. So we've tried like fitting the models just to separate decades and different sort of development measures like the GDP that was in there. And there's some small variation in the model parameters and the predicted plots that I showed, but not massive. So we're sort of fairly confident on the robustness of the results. Of course, like big limitations that I should point out, that we focused on immigration, not emigration, and that's because census data, so it's easy to collect from these questions where we were 1 year or 5 years ago. You can't really do that in the census to collect emigration. Yeah, there's also this idea about, of course, it's obvious, right, when we think about migration policy, that we're going to get more educated migrants at higher levels of development, because highly developed countries tend to sort of implement these migration policies that are kind of trying to attract high-skilled migrants. But there's a sort of quantitative measure that we know that we could try and factor that in. And then there's sort of a debate about whether the policy is sort of related, or it's related to the development levels. Do highly developed countries implement high-skilled policies, or is it the high-skilled policy that's helping the development of the country? So which way around of that is something to think about. I mean, we don't have any samples from like some major migration destinations, so Gulf states. Obviously, the migrants into those countries are going to be a lot lower educated, probably, the bigger flows coming in. So that would probably adjust the findings, and we don't have like classic traditional receiving countries like Australia and New Zealand. And we couldn't put a year control in there. We were having trouble with the identification. And then next steps, we hope, once we sorted out some of these problems, is to explore the bilateral migration data. So in some of the census questions, there are in the IPUMPS data, they give the location, the country of previous residence. They give it specifically. Sometimes it's just like China, or it might be other Asia. So in that case, it's a bit difficult to work with. But there is a possibility that we could try and look at this bilateral kind of origin-destination characteristics as not just the destination. And internal migration is something that we're really keen on, because that's most countries, when they're asking migration questions, they'll have on the region, and then hopefully we can pull some development indicators for at the region level as well, that we could run similar models. So I think, yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.